fundamentally, the reason that we're so passionate about it is at its core, it really has, I'll say, the best interests at heart. We know other things a lot of times come in and might sway a process this way or that, but at the end of the day, the goal of all of these assessments, environmental impact, regional, whatever they're called, the goal is actually to protect the environment. And of course, we're all a part of that environment. It's not just the land and animals, it's the people and the people that live on it and how we all interact with it. So as you know, Four Rivers, we're part of the Metallo First Nations Management Tribal Council. We've been a group since early in 2011, and we provide environmental and support services to our 9-member First Nations. And we essentially assist our communities to actively manage the lands and waters in their homelands, and really just through supporting community initiatives and capacity building. We have a team with a diverse set of backgrounds: environmental science, monitoring, geomatics, mining, and of course communications. And our vision is, as it always has been, is to have independent community lands and resource offices really connected through this regional network of common goals and services. So I always just throw this map up there. It's a little bit old school, but nothing's really changed actually since we started talking about this map 10 years ago. So here's the homelands kind of as they stand with the current network of at least all season roads. As we know, there's winter road networks up there and broadband going up, etc. But at the end of the day, as far as actual development of roads, of resources, etc., here it stands. So it's it will change down the road, but at the moment, here we go, and that's why we're talking today, right? It's important to get development right in these areas that are so valued to all of us. So the questions really are that in the face of unprecedented environmental changes from proposed industrial and infrastructure development, and of course in the face of an unpredictably changing climate, how do we ensure that the lands and waters, are protected for future generations? So that's why we're here today, to talk about environmental assessments, regional assessments, impact assessments. Really, they have that environment at the core, and it's a planning and decision-making tool. That's what all of these processes are. So what are the processes that I keep referencing? So most major projects in Ontario, they have to go through some form of environmental assessment or impact assessment before the project begins. So that's before shovels are in the ground. These are fundamental planning and decision-making tools to look at the details of those proposed projects, determine the potential environmental and social impacts, identify ways to enhance the positive impacts, decrease the negative, and of course, to predict the resulting impacts. The reason for that tool is to come to a decision. Can this project go ahead? Are the environmental risks too great, or can they be managed? And come to that decision. In this case, this is a government decision. These are government tools. But it is a tool that can be used by anybody to come to that decision on if it can proceed, how it can go ahead, and of course, types of mitigation or monitoring requirements are going to be required with that ultimate goal of protecting the environment. So when I say environment, I'm talking about everything. That includes us, it's the lands, the waters, everything that lives in it, and all of us that interact with it. So that's always a challenge when we're talking about environmental assessments, is there's a lot to look at. It includes socioeconomic conditions of communities, down to what fish species are in the water that could be impacted by development. So why do it? Again, avoid those negative impacts and increase those environmental protections. And for who is involved, so you hear a lot of language thrown around, you hear the word proponent a lot of times. That's just the person or the organization who's proposing to do the project. So that could be whomever, but at the end of the day, the proponent is the one responsible for going through these assessments. Government, of course, the federal and provincial government, the regulators, they have roles in this, and these are their processes that we're going to do today. First Nations with the potential to be affected by the project. So individuals who have homelands in those areas are involved. The public, And of course, a whole lot of consultants and contractors. So you see a lot of individuals and professionals that are involved in helping navigate these processes, helping do some of that science collection, et cetera. So there's a whole lot of people that you see involved in these impact assessments, environmental assessments. And of course, you do them before the project begins. So for how do you do them? Again, they're part of government processes that we'll be talking about today. So for the federal process, that's the impact assessment, and that is under the Impact Assessment Act, which came in a few years ago. And that's through the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada, which is part of Environment and Climate Change Canada. And when we're talking about the provincial process, that's the Provincial Environmental Assessment. That is through the Environmental Assessment Act, and that is through the Ministry of the Environment, Conservation, and Parks. And while we're talking about these assessments as part of these regulations, we're going to focus first just on these steps that are common to all of these processes, just so we can get an idea of the heart of these assessments. Sarah?
Yeah, just to say, this is a bit, again, Kim's going to be talking about what's in common between them, but just to re-clarify and re-emphasize that that the processes overall, again, are to support a decision-making at government. So before they approve a permit or approve the permits or whatever approvals are required from, say, the government of Canada or from the province to allow that project to occur. So it's a process that occurs before that. So not every project is necessarily subjected to both a federal process or a provincial process or both or what have you. It really depends on the nature of the project itself. And then again, just to stress that the decision making that's occurring in these processes is being done by the government at the end as part of the processes. So just bear that in mind as we go through. I just wanted to throw it out there. But as we're going to see now, Kim's going to kind of go through the overall, regardless if it's provincial or it's federal or the specific nature, kind of how it flows.
Awesome. So for the how do you do an environmental assessment or an impact assessment, there's these general steps that are common to all of them. And like I said, we're just going to spend a little bit of time here today just so we can understand the heart of these processes, and then we can think about them better in relation to the proposed projects that are in the area. So the first step is, of course, determining if an assessment is required. And of course, since these are government processes, that kind of falls in the hands of the federal and provincial government. So for the federal government, the proponent, so the individual who's doing the project, they prepare a project description. And that's where the federal government then receives it and determines if an impact assessment is required. And so that project description, again, that's just a big document that describes that proposed project in detail. For the provincial environmental assessment, it's the proponent that actually talks to the province ahead of time to figure out if that environmental assessment is required. So they may use that project description to talk about it, but it's not required in the provincial process. And through the proponent talking with the province, they can come into an agreement called a voluntary agreement to do an individual environmental assessment. And a lot of times that's because Ontario's legislation will require a pile of permits to do a project, but that proponent can essentially satisfy a lot of the requirements of those permits by doing this one overarching environmental assessment. So it tends to be in their favor to volunteer to do an environmental assessment rather than complying with what can be a lot of cumbersome, smaller requirements. So I have a little example in this diagram here that we'll just speak to briefly. So this is a theoretical underground mine with you see the road going to it and maybe some wastewater collection ponds, et cetera, kind of in the area, and some waste rock piles. So we're going to think about it at this point as the proponent who's proposing to do the project has given us the description of this proposed mine and road in much more detail than I just did. So now they need to plan the environmental assessment. So essentially, they need to write out a plan to outline what needs to happen and what studies need to be included. So these include information such as the study that they're going to look at. Generally, there's a local study area, which is that immediate footprint, and then there's going to be a regional study area, which often can be defined by watersheds, because the water, of course, connects the land. Other factors to consider throughout the environmental assessments, those are all the environmental effects, impacts to traditional land use and peoples in the area, cumulative effects, so no project occurs in isolation. There could be other projects proposed as well that could increase or decrease the impacts of that project, health in the area, cultural values, socioeconomic conditions, alternatives to the project. Maybe we don't need a road, maybe we'll use a hover barge to get things in and out, whatever it might be. So for the federal process, for the federal impact assessment, that plan is called the Tailored Impact Assessment Guidelines. And that's prepared by the federal government and adjusted after getting public comment. And for the provincial environmental assessment, that plan is called the Terms of Reference. And that one's written by the proponent and again, has to be approved by the government. So for actually conducting the environmental assessment now, they follow these plans now that they're approved to look at the potential effects of the project. So the way that they're going to do this is they start by collecting baseline information in the field and also in communities to determine the current state of the environment. So that means they're going to be sending out a lot of individuals to talk to communities and to actually collect scientific data as well, to figure out what is the environment now without this project. What does it look like? So that's information on land, water, fish, birds, traditional land use, valued areas, health, infrastructure, whatever it might be. They want to have this list of valued components. So they want this list of what are the important parts of this environment. So remember, because it's a paper-based process, they need to come down to lists and how to write it all out. So this thing that we all know and feel that is the environment all around us, how do we put that in writing so that we can use this tool effectively? So in our example, they're looking at this land and they see that there's moose in the area. So maybe there's a calving site, maybe there's some paths that cross. Maybe there's individuals who like to hunt in this particular area. That's information they need to find out and include in that baseline data collection. Maybe there's sturgeon in these waters. Sturgeon are a species at risk. So there's another aspect of legislation that needs to come into play to assess if they are in these waters and how their protection will be at the heart of the assessment. And also it's a valued species for our community members. So how will that value be protected? So they're going to look at the air. So maybe the value is clean air, but the value could also be the birds that use the air. There could be a nesting site nearby. There could be low noise levels currently, and that's a value as well. How are people using this area? Is this a travel route? Is this a teaching site? We want to basically document at this stage all of the uses of this area by people, lands, and animals, and we want to ensure we understand what the current state is. Maybe it's a blueberry picking site, maybe there's medicinal plants of value, maybe that pond back there is a wild rice harvesting site, and wild rice is very sensitive to changes in water level. So those are all conditions that need to be understood at this moment in time. And then now they look at how is that project going to interact with the environment. So again, they have that detailed project in front of them. For example, they're going to look at that road. It's going to cause increased traffic. It's going to cross habitat. It's going to increase access to the area. And now we add in those animals, that environment, the people that use the area, and we're looking at how they intersect, how that's going to interact with each other, and are those impacts going to end up being positive or negative. So if we look at the example of that moose, so the road is crossing his habitat, so maybe that kind of sucks for the moose and he can't quite go in that area the same way. But if that road went on his calving grounds or her calving grounds, that's going to be a concern. If that moose is crossing the road and ends up getting struck by a vehicle, that's of course a concern to the moose itself. but it's also a concern to the individuals who are driving the vehicles. So now there's safety concerns in the area with vehicles. And that's also could be a loss of habitat if that moose ends up not wanting to cross the road because of the noise of the traffic, etc. Again, so that example of the teaching site, maybe it's a benefit to some individuals because now it's easier to get to that site. Before you had to take 5 portages to get to that lake. So, you weren't able to get out there as often, but now you can use that road. And so it's easier to access the site. That could be viewed as a positive, but is the quality of experience the same if there's a potential mine kind of next door to it? So again, are these impacts, are these interactions positive or negative? How significant are the impacts? Now, the real challenge with assigning significance always has to do with whose perspective you're talking about. So the significance of the impacts to that individual moose, well, if one of the environmental impacts is increased access for hunters, and that moose has a much greater risk of getting killed, if you're looking at significance from the moose perspective, that's a significant impact. He doesn't want to die. If you're looking at it from the hunter's perspective, that could be a positive impact because now it's easier to go hunt that moose and harvest for meat for the family. And maybe that's a positive impact for the community because there's more food coming in. So when we're talking about the significance of impacts, it really is the challenge of perspective. And that's why it's so important for people to get involved in this process. It's very easy in these processes because they're large and they're involving and they can feel confusing, that the voices of the proponent or of government, they've got a lot of resources behind it. Their voices can be strong and at the forefront. So that's always a challenge for our communities and always something that we really encourage and try to support is to get involved and informed on these processes and make your voices heard, because it's so important to be involved, to know that there's a teaching site there and know that there's a loss of value and to have that either mitigated so the impact's lessened or avoided altogether. Maybe that road needs to take a different path because that site is too important where it is and that road doesn't need to be there. It could be, a mile away and still do the same job that it was intended to do. So we're on the last few steps. Now we got a whole lot of paperwork, right? So we've done all that science and all that research and talked to a whole bunch of people. We're writing all of that in these reports so that results of the environmental or impact assessment are written in these reports, presenting all that assessment that had been done, everybody who was involved, everybody that was talked to, and the conclusions. And then in the federal impact assessment process, that's called the impact statement report, written by the proponent and given to government. And then the government will take that and they write an impact assessment report. I know these phrases are confusing, but essentially the proponent writes the summary of what they did, and then the government takes it and does the assessment portion before they talk to the public and communities about it. And then in the provincial process, that's called the environmental assessment report, written by the proponent and submitted to government. So it's the proponent that's kind of gathering that feedback on the meat of the document. And all of these documents have public comment periods, community engagement periods where they want to hear from people and to understand if they got this project right. Because at the end of the day, they have to come to a decision. So they're going to look at those documents, including all that feedback, decide if those negative impacts are likely to be significant. So essentially they're going to weigh, the economic benefits, the access benefits, whatever all those benefits are against those inevitable negatives that are going to come from development. You can't build anything on the land without there being some sort of impact, but they're going to decide on if it's essentially interest, has the proponent done enough to avoid these impacts, to make this project the best possible and in the best interest of all Canadians, all Ontarians, whatever it might be. And they're going to release a decision outlining if that project can proceed and how. So that could include terms and conditions on that approval, mitigation measures, things they need to adjust in that final project before it can go ahead, as well as monitoring and follow-up programs. And that's this last bubble here, is that after that EA is done and that project goes ahead, there's going to be follow-up programs where the regulators have to confirm if those predicted impacts were accurate, because that's always a challenge. This is a tool, and we all know everything looks different when it's actually in the ground and out and operating. So were the predicted impacts accurate? Was there anything unanticipated that came up that now needs to be adjusted to ensure the environment is still protected? And also monitoring for compliance to conditions. So if they put in the condition that they need to monitor the waters next to that tailings pond, you know, let's say every month they need to do a check on the waters to ensure nothing's coming into it. They do have some enforcement measures to ensure that that is happening, and those schedules are right in those conditions of the environmental assessment to ensure that they're adhering to those goals. So again, the goal of all of this process is to protect the environment for future generations. Go ahead, Sarah.
Yeah, just to add before we jump into a little further and re-clarify, like as mentioned, again, it's a government regulatory process, and we've gone pretty high level here to kind of what overarching is. Obviously, all these elements get a lot more complicated, and when you kind of start getting into the details. So an element, for example, in the decision making and the follow-up and monitoring and how that will have to look, factors that play into that include other forms of legislation that the government is responsible for administering. So legislation, say, under the Species at Risk Act, as Kim already kind of mentioned, Navigable Waters Act, what have you. There's a whole long list of it. And so I just wanted to say and just kind of remind everyone that, you know, we don't have a lot of time today. We're only taking an hour. But when I was first introduced to this myself, I took a full day long course just on the Environmental Assessment Act, which is a previous couple of iterations back, a previous act, but a few versions back of that. And that was just a full day just spent trying to just understand that act, not even including all the other acts that played into it. And that's just on the federal side. So where it gets challenging for communities and everyone to deal with is this interplay of a whole bunch of other factors, not only in the process itself, but then in the scope of all the factors that are associated with impacts on the environment from any given thing. And so the size and the scale and the whole nature of it really comes down to the project itself, the environment itself, and all the rest. But I just wanted to go back to the point that Kim made and really re-stress it, that the important thing from our perspective is that whatever the end is, whatever decision comes out, whatever the final report is, it really does in the end, it's made up of and comes from those who participated and used their voice and all the rest. That's kind of the final essence. So, you know, we really encourage people getting involved. It's hard, but the more input that goes into it, ultimately the better, more robust product and better decisions that can be arrived at the end.
Absolutely. Thank you. So really quick, I'm going to show you what the legislative processes are. And again, we're going to share this slide deck afterwards. And there's a whole bunch of websites at the end that, you know, this information is best provided by the individuals who kind of own these processes and these projects. But we're going to give it in a nutshell today, just as it's always hard to spend time on these. So for provincial environmental assessments, that's under the Ontario Environmental Assessment Act. This is one of the oldest pieces of environmental legislation actually in the country. It was established in 1975, but more recently, Bill 197, Schedule 6 to be specific, proposes a lot of amendments to the Ontario Environmental Assessment Act. So we don't know where those are going to land, and we're not going to spend time on that today. But certainly, at the moment, the traditional act, the current act, allows for two types of environmental assessments. One is a class environmental assessment, and those are for smaller projects with what's considered to be predictable impacts. And I know there was a real push to get a lot more class environmental assessments kind of set over the years, which I believe the new bill is looking to scale back. But the one we're going to focus on today is the individual environmental assessment. That's the whole process that we were talking about. Essentially, there's the voluntary agreement with the proponent that kind of tends to kick it off. It's guided by terms of reference, and it's a coordinated effort between the Ontario ministries. So I'm not going to spend a long time on this, but just in a nutshell, there's our process that we kind of went through on the right. So is the EA required? Is the proponent going to enter into that voluntary agreement to do that full environmental assessment? Then they go through planning the environmental assessment, which is a terms of reference that's written by the proponent and submitted to the government for consideration. And then they go through conducting the EA. That can take, several years. Often I hear it referred to as 3 years of time, but really it's years and years. A lot of times, if a proponent's even thinking of a project, they're going to start to collect that baseline environmental data ahead of time. They're going to write it all in a report. They're going to give it to the government, and then that minister is going to work through the decision on whether or not the project can go ahead and how it can go ahead, and any follow-up programs kind of in the conditions of that approval. So I just have another visual here. This is actually from one of the project environmental assessments that's going right now, but I thought it was a really nice visual. It's a much more simplified process than that wordy one that I showed previously, but I'll invite you to look at that closer in the slide deck afterwards. It's essentially the same process, but yeah, a little easier to see. I'm going to focus a little bit more on the federal processes because this is where we get into impact assessments and regional assessments. So I'll talk about them in a moment. But the federal impact assessments is through the Impact Assessment Act, as I mentioned, which is the IAC, Impact Assessment Agency of Canada. When you hear SEA, that used to be the Canadian Environmental Assessment Agency. So you hear SEA or you hear SEA 2012. That was the old agency and that was the old legislation. So the new Impact Assessment Act came in a few years ago. And with that, SEA changed its name to the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada, IAAC. So they're the same thing, just current name. That's also when they changed their language from environmental assessment to impact assessment. So it's a little bit more robust in language is why they did that. Again, part of Environment and Climate Change Canada, but the same idea. You have the same, they've actually call it a 5-phase process. You see how it connects to the steps we just went through. Again, you have the planning, you have that impact statement, which is basically doing the impact assessment, takes about 3 years. And then they write the impact assessment, which is a different level of reporting, and it goes to decision making afterwards. I encourage you to check out Impact Assessment Agency of Canada's website. I'll give you that URL on a slide at the end, but they actually have training. They have some online modules where you can take really, I guess, as long as you need. But as Sarah mentioned, back in the day, they used to do a one-day training course in person just specific to the legislation. They've put a lot of that online now. They have webinars for that. And you can walk through modules to get a better understanding of this federal process. And that's where they have those kind of symbols there as well that talk about the different participation opportunities for Indigenous communities to participate in these processes. So again, I'm not going to spend long on this process, but I threw this in there just so that you have it on hand. This was kind of their summary. They provided at something in the past, but they have a pre-planning phase now as well, because a lot of the concerns was that by the time it got to that project description phase, the proponent had already done a lot of the thinking on the project. So they have a pre-planning phase now where they really want to make sure they're talking to, especially First Nation communities, prior to the project getting proposed and kind of going through the system, because the system has legislated timelines associated with it. So that's where some of the timelines are shown there. For the planning phase, 180 days, and then for the impact statement, so going through that impact assessment process can be up to 3 years, and then you kind of see the timelines from there. I will also point out in this diagram, there is still the allowance for impact assessment by review panel. Still not totally clear on what triggers a review panel versus a regular impact assessment, but that is still there, and it also has regulated timelines on it, which review panels didn't in the old SIA 2012. So one slide I just threw in here is that with the new Impact Assessment Act, they actually opened up a lot of opportunities and a lot of cooperation is what they were emphasizing very early on, and those opportunities are still there. The current government is obviously the same government that put in this new act, and they very much are open to more new ways of doing things. They understand that their regulated process isn't necessarily the best way to do it, so they can allow for things like substitution if Indigenous communities or groups of Indigenous communities have their own assessment process. They can actually say that, okay, this process is equivalent or better to our regulated process, so that process can go ahead instead of the federal process. They also have the ability to, of course, coordinate with the provincial process to try and harmonize that process. That's still there. So I just threw this in there that those opportunities exist within this act, and it is something that obviously has been talked about along the way in the past.
So just to clarify, there's still certain criteria or assessment which would be required to if these things took place or how. So the key was that they built in the allowances. But, you know, say in the case of substitution, the language they're using is jurisdiction. So in a lot of cases, they would refer to a jurisdiction as like a province or some kind of recognized body that has recognized a form of decision-making authority already kind of inherently developed. So there's in some cases to actually utilize that, there might be a ways to go and stuff for communities, but the important part here is that the new act has this language and has these opportunities, and that's something that we didn't see in certainly the previous iteration of the Environmental Assessment Act of 2012, but even the previous versions. So that is an exciting development, and yeah.
Awesome. So when you hear the phrase, so we've gone through environmental assessments, provincial, and impact assessments, federal, you'll also hear phrases like regional assessments and strategic assessments, which are also allowed for under that newer Impact Assessment Act. So again, both are kind of at the direction of the Minister of Environment. A strategic assessment, admittedly, I don't know a lot about them, but essentially it's to examine, from their website, the Government of Canada's existing or proposed policies, plans, or programs relevant to impact assessments. But what we'll focus on today is regional assessments. So the point of a regional assessment is to assess the effects of existing or future physical activities carried out in a region. So the purpose of that is to inform planning and future management of cumulative effects and to inform project impact assessments. So the purpose of a regional assessment, it's different from a project impact assessment, but the goal of it is to help provide that cumulative effect and that higher view, I guess I'll say, of a region as a whole, so that when those projects are proposed to go forward, they can better figure out how it's going to fit in and how those impacts are going to be. So it's to help inform project impact assessments so that each individual project impact assessment doesn't have, I'll say, the burden of considering the entire region. Burden's maybe not the right word, but it's difficult because in an area such as the Ring of Fire, which has been directed by the minister to undergo a regional assessment, a lot of times it can be a challenge because the first mine in, the first mine proposed well, they're the first off the gate, so they're going to do their best to think about cumulative effects, but they're kind of in isolation. So the regional assessment is trying to provide tools and more information to the area as a whole, so that as one mine or 20 mines go in, there's that a body of knowledge that can help contribute to those project impact assessments. So again, it allows the government to go beyond project-focused IAs and understand the regional context. It can provide a more comprehensive analysis to help inform those decisions. Because remember, the government has to make that decision. So that's why it's a minister order for something like a regional assessment to happen, because the minister needs more information on the regional context. And that's when these kind of projects are going to go ahead. And so the agency is developing a policy to help clarify the conduct of these regional assessments. They are quite new, but some of the information that they've provided, and again, I encourage you to check out their website. There's actually a link right on their main page of more information on impact and regional assessments, but they're meant for the scope to be flexible. They can be designed to allow a better understanding of and response to regional issues. And so the goals and activities in regional assessments, they might look different, but there's a range of approaches that they can use. And that range includes filling data gaps and analyzing trends. So those data gaps could be in traditional Western science, information on what bird and bat species are in the area. But it could also be data gaps just on the context of the communities that live in the area, how the land is used, and those relationships between the communities. They can establish threshold and standard mitigation measures. So maybe there's some sort of standard, I don't know, I'll pull it off the top of my head, something like maybe certain project activities can't happen during certain hunting seasons. And maybe that's a standard that has to be applied across the region, whatever it may be. And then they're going to also support the identification of regional development objectives and scenarios. So I'm not going to go through that diagram, but essentially they vary in complexity and cost, and it all depends on how they're scoped. Go ahead, Sarah.
Yeah, so we brought this up, and I just want to point out or note that, again, as Kim said, this is really new. So it's a new act, and and these are kind of a new item within the act. So we haven't actually seen how they'll play out in Canada yet. So what Kim's kind of provided you here is kind of their words from their site, which again, we encourage you to check out. But there's still a huge amount of uncertainty as to how it would play out within our region specifically. And kind of the real details of it are something that is even still really being worked upon. So we're a long ways from having the answers as to what that would look like, but it's important to, at least as a base point, starting point, see what the intent is, at least what's being published online in terms of the overall gist of it.
So just in a nutshell, environmental assessment, impact assessment, regional assessment, they are all planning and decision-making tools. They examine the interactions between the proposed project, aspects of the environment, including health and social and economic conditions that are important to you and your community. And again, that goal is always to protect the environment for future generations. So what are the projects? I know you probably wanted us to spend way more time on this, but the reality is, and we're going to be perfectly honest with that, is we're not the experts on the projects. We've been assisting a few communities as requested to assist them in engagement on the projects, but you are best to hear it directly from the proponents of these projects. So we're going to let you know what the projects are in a nutshell, but we encourage you to, view their individual websites. All the contact information is there. And if you as an individual or your community want to get more involved, please let the proponents know, drop them a line, connect with them. Everybody's very open and willing to talk, and they want as much input into these processes as they can. Yeah,
so we're giving this just a quick run through to try and what they are. Again, as Kim said, we're not the experts on these at all. But more just we felt it important to mention and recap on this. So we kind of just put in context of what we've just been talking about. It's a good example to illustrate the processes we've just been discussing, and ultimately we thought it was timely to again reintroduce the processes overall, because we do have some activity going on in our area relative to we're actually seeing either the start of or the ongoing of some of these types of processes. So throw it back to Kim.
Awesome. So I'm doing this old school. So back in the day, Sarah and I would put a map up on the wall of the proposed projects in the Ring of Fire, and we would point at the map and we would talk about the projects. So I can't do that here today in a way that you can see, but I can share a map that I can kind of pan around on. So I zoomed up on, this is a fabulous map made internally and with data that was shared from the project proponents. So it's as accurate as it can be. But the first project I'll highlight for you today is the Martin Falls Community Access Road project. So this is a permanent, about 200-kilometer all-season gravel surface road that Martin Falls First Nation is the proponent of, and they are proposing to construct it to connect the community of Martin Falls First Nation to essentially the provincial highway network. So to connect to the forestry roads that are already reaching up just north of Airland First Nation. And so there are going to be road improvements on those forestry roads, and Airland, I believe, is looking after that. But those roads are already there. So the Martin Falls project specifically is shown in this purple haze area because the actual pathway of the roads is not fully decided yet. So this is the local study area, and the roads will fall somewhere within this pathway, and there's multiple alternatives that they're looking at. So again, the purpose of this road is to provide reliable all-season road access for Martin Falls First Nation, to and from Martin Falls First Nation and the provincial highway network. And the goals are to increase travel safety, reduce the cost of food, fuel, and supplies to Martin Falls First Nation, and provide access to future economic development opportunities. So as you know, Martin Falls First Nation is currently a remote access community, accessible only by seasonal winter road, which is this corridor here that you see in red. But in recent years, especially with climate change, that particular winter road network is a lot less reliable than it has been in the past. And there's been some years where that road's only been open for a few weeks. So it's a very small window to get in food, fuel, supplies, really for the whole year. It's a small window. It's very tight. It's very restrictive. And at the end of the day, it just increases the cost of all of these items overall for the community. And based on the information that's come out directly from the proponent, there's a real desire, especially by Martin Falls' youth, to be connected through a road network and to really be able to see family and have that connection and those opportunities that it could provide. Go ahead, Sarah.
Oh, nope. I didn't mean to unmute.
No worries, no worries. So again, in a nutshell, it's a permanent 2-lane gravel surface road. It'll have a right-of-way that's clear to about 60 meters. So it's going to have about a 10-meter top width of the road. It's going to include about 50 bridge or culvert installations. So there will be a fair number of water crossings, and they'll need to have things like borrow areas for aggregate and gravel, some temporary work camps, etc., as it's being constructed. So Martin Falls First Nation is responsible for the planning and design of the proposed project, but the ultimate responsibility for the construction, operation, and maintenance of that road is yet to be determined through negotiations between the proponent, so Martin Falls, and the province. So again, I'll give you all the URLs at the end, which I'll encourage you to check out their website. It's a great website. It's got a lot of good information on it and a lot of great maps, etc. And so there's contact information there for the proponent as well. And again, if that's an area of interest to you, if that's within your community's homelands area, or you use these areas, the proponent wants to hear from you. So the next one I'm going to highlight, I'm just going to zip up here, and that would be the Webequie Supply Road project. So in this case, Webequie First Nation is the proponent. And what they are proposing is a close to 100-kilometer all-season gravel surface road to connect Webequie First Nation from their airport area to the Ring of Fire in the McFalls Lake area. So that's the area that Noron has their proposed underground mine still, and future potential mining activities. So the purpose of this road is Webequie First Nation wants to realize the opportunities to improve the community's economic and social well-being. So that's to connect Webequie First Nation to the future mining activities and opportunities in the Ring of Fire area, and to essentially move materials, supplies, equipment, and people. So this road is not proposed to connect to the provincial highway system at this moment. You can see the kind of red lines here that are Webequie First Nation's current winter road connections. And so those will remain for the time being. And again, it's to connect the community to the opportunities at the Ring of Fire. There's currently no planned dedicated connection between Webequie First Nation and the roads. And it's going to, so just in a nutshell, again, it's going to be a gravel surface road. It's going to have about a 35-meter right-of-way. It's going to accommodate a large range of traffic. It's going to have the same drainage systems, and it's going to need borrow pits, and it's going to need some work camps probably along the way. But it's going to cross about 3 major water crossings between Webequie First Nation and the Ring of Fire area. So one thing I will highlight is that the first 17 kilometers of this road are actually within Webequie First Nations reserve lands. So the actual road use and access controls are going to be determined, and especially for that on reserve portion, and especially if and when down the road it is connected to the provincial highway network. So we always talk about what's that missing link or missing kind of piece connecting this all, and that's this this road that's in green. So this road is actually not in any sort of environmental or impact assessment process right now. It's just very much in the early planning stages. But the Northern Road Link was actually announced in March of 2020, kind of shortly before this pandemic locked us all down. But the co-proponents for the road are Webequie and Martin Falls First Nation, and the actual location, timing, ownership and funding and feasibility of these future roads is all kind of unknown at this time. So I know I'm running out of time, so I'm not going to connect it too much to the processes. It is going to be in your slides, and I'll show you a slide on it really quick. But just in summary, those two roads, the Webequie Supply Road as well as the Martin Falls Community Access Road, are currently, they have their impact statement guidelines from the federal government. So they're in the impact statement phase, which is the 3 years of them doing their assessment. And for the provincial process, they both have terms of reference that have been submitted to the provincial government and are open for comments. Comments have been extended on the Webequie Supply Road to the end of November, and Martin Falls is currently has the timeline to just before Christmas, December 21st, for comments on their terms of reference. So again, these are both early stages of their environmental and impact assessments for these processes. There is plenty of time to be involved and plenty of opportunities open right now for you and your communities to get involved. The last thing I will mention, and then I'll throw it to Sarah for a few thoughts, is the regional assessment. So there has been a regional assessment that was announced by the federal government in February, and that was announced by the minister. So as we mentioned, regional assessments are a little bit new, and certainly the one for the Ring of Fire, the scope and the study area, everything has not yet been determined. So they've just recently been reaching out to communities and organizations to gauge interest in engagement in participating in scoping this regional assessment. So while you see the Ring of Fire area up here, the actual Ring of Fire area that will be used for the regional assessment, that scope, that area, that lay of the land, and everyone who will be involved is yet to be determined.
So just to summarize just quickly then what Kim said in the context of all the processes we were talking about, currently for kind of the map you see here, we have 2 proposed projects, the Webequay Supply Road and the Martin Falls Community Access Road. They each are going through 2 processes, provincial environmental assessment and a federal impact assessment. And then additionally announced, we have a regional assessment. So we're up to 5 processes right now on this map. And then we would anticipate, to come, there'll be another 2 processes for that northern road link. So as that develops, but we're still very early on. So just for the items discussed here, linking back to the processes, we're looking at over the next few years, 7 kind of processes on the go. So, and then just to other, there are, so that's just in this area on this map. But just a nod to, and I see we have a question from Paul, just to acknowledge that there are other processes or various stages kind of within the region. I'll let Kim just put a note to just quickly updating on where Greenstone Gold is. Yeah, they're done. So they've already gone through the whole process relative to their project at the Hard Rock site. And that included, you can correct me if I'm wrong, Kim, but that included an extensive or relatively extensive transport or highway relocation or movement.
That's all part of it. Yep.
So that process has been completed. And I'll let Kim just throw in if there's anything else on the works.
Yeah, I think there's some other project kind of in the region, but nothing that's really going through a full environmental or impact assessment. So there could be some that are triggering more like class environmental assessments, like if that's transmission lines or like the broadband project. So again, if those are considered to be lower in impact, then they don't trigger provincial environmental assessment. So right now, these are the 2 larger ones that are triggering these processes. And yeah, Greenstone Gold completely wrapped up not too long ago. They haven't quite started their full construction. They're still, I think, getting a lot of their final permits, because remember, the assessments give them all the information they need to maybe get those permits, but at the end of the day, they still need to get those fisheries permits, forest harvesting permits, etc. So they still need to have those permits in hand before they can do that work. So again, this will be on the slides. We'll give you the deck afterwards. And I know we said we'd wrap it at noon, but we're still around for a few questions if some people want at the end. But the kind of the last message I'll throw out here is, please get involved. Your voice is important in all these processes and get informed. If any of these processes kind of tweaked your interest and you'd like more information, we've got the list of websites here. If there's a question you think of afterwards and you want to drop Sarah or I an email, by all means, we'll try our best to answer them. And again, the best sources of information, especially for those individual projects, is the proponents themselves, is those teams. They've got the experts on hand, and they're ready, willing, and able, and eager to talk about it. So, any final thoughts, Sarah?
Well, just a nod to Paul's question there about kind of the previous project with the previous studies under previous legislation. Yes. And I guess that's just a nod to or a throw in that overall makes the processes really complicated, because in the last 10 years alone, we're on our third totally different set of rules in terms of what federally an environmental now impact assessment looks like in Canada. So the timelines for a lot of these things at this point, or at least in the last decade, have exceeded what the legislation has been in place for. But yeah, I believe the Greenstone Golds wrapped up last year, if not 2 years ago. Kim can correct me.
Just over a year ago, I think.
Yeah, so it's been done, and it was put under the previous federal or previous legislation federally. And I guess just a nod to, we've talked about, as Kim mentioned too, and to re-stress, we talked about the current provincial system, but as she said, that is up for change too right now. So sometimes when a new legislation comes in midstream, the previous process gets kind of grandfathered in. Sometimes, there might be added conditions or what have you, but it's I guess just a nod that the processes have been, at least in the last decade, always evolving.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so Greenstone Gold did go through these full provincial and federal environmental/impact assessments. The federal legislation kind of changed while they were going through it, but they did go through the full things. And then so Watay Power, I'm not totally up on, because I know it just kind of comes up to our homelands, but I do believe they're going through full environmental and impact assessments on those power transmission lines.
Yeah, and just to again acknowledge Paul there, the what we really wanted to, it is complicated, and it's really hard to not only find the time to get involved in these processes, but even just navigate through them. It's a real challenge, and it's really hard to figure out how to. But really, really stressing, at least from our perspective, it is very important to get involved, because it is the input, the feedback that comes from communities and people and groups that do influence. And I would say that, yes, certainly relative to new stuff coming out where they haven't figured out exactly how it might look yet, there's not necessarily a precedent set because it hasn't been done before. My impression, and I'm not the government of Canada, I can't speak for them, but my impression would be that that there would be more opportunity to influence it because of the lack of precedence in terms of how it was done the last time in a different circumstance.
Yeah, they want to hear from you on how it could be done. So I know we're out of time. I know we have a few conversations kind of coming through on the chat, which is awesome. So I'm going to say thank you, but we will stay on the line a bit if there's a few more questions. But for anybody who has to run, we completely understand. And Miigwech, thank you for joining us today. And Laura's going to send out just in a little while a survey. Just let us know how this platform is. How was it for you? Is it awful? Is it great? Any feedback is always appreciated. And yeah, we'll send out that slide deck as well, so you have it in hand and you have all those websites handy and can reference them. And please do, and let us know if you have any questions. We've got our contact information there as well. And thank you for spending some time with us today, Miigwech.
Yeah, and just to further elaborate, we would really love to hear from you, because obviously, like I said, we've really only skimmed the surface at a super high level of these things, and obviously there's so much more that could be talked about. and for those of you who joined, we had already done a webinar 2, just was talking about cumulative effects and put that in the context of regional assessments. So there's a lot of aspects of this that people might be interested in. So we would really be interested in knowing what you're interested in, so we can try to maybe make that happen in a future webinar. So thanks also again, and it's so nice to be joined by all of you after so long of not seeing each other.
I'm glad. So I guess if you have any questions, you can wave or put it in the chat, or just start talking. We'll stay on the line for about the next 15 minutes or so if anybody has anything. And otherwise, awesome, and have a great day. And I'm sure everybody's hungry. And have a happy Halloween, right? Not seeing too many questions there. If you have to take yourself off mute, we'll wait a few more minutes just to confirm. Want to hear me rambling the whole time?
Kim, it's Paul here. I won't write it in. Is there a way we can have, I don't know if there's some options that we could develop for what a regional assessment could look like, and different on the spectrum, what we think that could look like? Because, I mean, as you said, it is pretty open-ended. There's a lot of flexibility, but maybe if we flushed out some ideas for the what the regional assessment could be, recognizing these are the assessments that are there now, and maybe if we did some options with a spectrum of what they would be like, because I don't think obviously the feds, maybe the province have, and I think that probably if we did come up with some options, I mean, the ideal one is in some ways is having obviously more regional strategic one, and for companies it would make their life easier, because if you have multiple, I mean, maybe it's great for environmental companies, but for some of the proponents, having multiple, to go through multiple EAs is expensive, whereas if you have one regional one that is everyone's involved in, you get to share the information, and you don't have to do assessments on the same fish that are going to travel the same river. Everyone can use that information as a collective decision-making tool. And then I mean, I guess I'm thinking on a larger level, we have to go into the governance side of larger permanent monitoring bodies, whether that's, I mean, and I'm not sure whether, I guess maybe that's a recommend, like if you have, I know if you have a panel review, that's a recommendation that can come out of that. And it does carry a lot of weight if it comes out of that type of a review, because then it deals with a lot of the issues that are not dealt with in the existing EAs, which is what the frustration everyone has. And even having seen the existing EAs that are out there, some are really quite good, but it's not, it's what's missing in them is the issue, not so much which is in the EA, it's what's not in the EA, their terms of reference. That's probably the bigger issue. And the proponent, you can't ask the proponent to deal with larger governance questions. Yeah. They're not going to want to go there. That's not their bailiwick.
Yeah, so I'll throw it over to Sarah in a moment, just because she's been more spearheading those larger thoughts, obviously over the past year, and certainly spurred on since February. But Yeah, like the impression I get, so like I said, the federal government is reaching out right now because they want to engage with communities and with groups. And they want to hear these ideas and they want to flesh it out. So I know when I was chatting actually with Ganugaming First Nation yesterday, and then there was well, what about the regional framework agreement and the work that had been done? And as we know, that was very much a provincial initiative where the feds never really did come to the table. So what I encouraged, at least that individual, was if there was good aspects of that table that you experienced, let's talk about it. And that's the kind of information that the federal government needs to hear is, through the experience of that process, which tried to address multifaceted areas, like were there things that really worked? Were there recommendations? Like, I think this is the time for the federal government to hear some of those lived examples, but then also obviously hear, everything else. Who wants to be involved? What can the scope be? Like, should the scope be on filling those environmental data gaps that exist, that we know exist in the North? Like, is that the focus of it, or this monitoring regime for a long-term vision? And like, it's very open, and it can really go anywhere. Obviously, you saw that little continuum that had the, complexity and cost. So, I mean, nothing's ever a bottomless funding opportunity, but they have a big challenge ahead of them to try and scope this out to meet their goal of better informing project impact assessments when they come down the line. Sarah?
Yeah, it's it kind of gets caught up or swallowed into this realm of how big can it be and how big is it going to be, and you can very quickly get it. We and I think our communities look at things very holistically and a much more bigger picture oriented than maybe certain even, let's say, departments or various groups do look at things. Unfortunately, and again, this is a federal process, remember, so federally individual departments are very much used to operating in their individual scopes of authority and such. So there's a lot of challenges in getting everyone together and going a right direction. And I would say that at least the impression I've had and the discussions I have had with various government groups has been that there is a sincerity at this point in terms of there's a desire to try and be as bigger picture and again, this idea of openness, especially in the context of the current government's push for reconciliation and such. So I do feel there's an opportunity, but we do have a challenge even articulating even what the best solution would be. But yeah, there are certainly a lot of good examples out. We've put forward or tried to share some stories recently about successes we've seen in the region. And obviously what we've heard from communities is models or processes where communities are in the lead. They're very involved. They have structures that are integrating and engaging with community, and they're in a place and they have the resources and the processes to really influence that is kind of what would be overall desirable. So I do think there's an opportunity there for sure. And there are already some good solutions, good examples of things that have been done within Matawa homelands that could fill that.
I guess I'm going to some of the experiences in the Northwest Territories that we saw, some of the governance structures that they developed that were community led, and are recognized in law that are just standard ways of doing business now.
Yeah, the important contrast in a recent conversation we had with the federal group, it sounds so the biggest contrast between here and what we saw up in Northwest Territories is the participation or the different dynamic of the provincial factor. That being the province. So again, just keeping in mind that currently, while there's opportunities to work and link together under the various federal and provincial processes, those don't always happen. And so currently my understanding, the regional assessment has been announced, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the province, has to or will, or it's unknown of how the province might interact with that. So whereas that's a very different circumstance, that kind of just that singular element is a very different circumstance than what we saw up in Northwest Territories. But nonetheless, federally does still exist and provincial does exist where we're operating. So there's, regardless of what the province, how it fits or how it works or interplays, the federal processes can be, I guess, worked within alone or separately.
Awesome. Were there any other questions or anything while we're still on the line that you want to share with the group? You can always email us separately.
Hi, Kip.
Hey, Henry.
Yeah, what Paul was saying about the regional is that he's right. It has to be community driven, and when you get the common folk involved in the beginning, it's going to work. But also, different on the regional side, is the communities themselves have to talk together without lawyers, without anybody else to get that common ground.
Mm-hmm.
But even within the community, you have your split, your elders and your young people. Elders don't want environmental damage, but you got your young people. So all those differences got to be worked out in the beginning, which is a good thing. Then you go into the next phase of legislation and then lawyers at the end, kind of thing. That's what happened with the regional framework agreement. The lawyers were involved in the beginning.
Yep.
None of the common people were heard. And the government puts that in there to drag it out. So they got to change their thinking.
Yeah, I think thank you so much for those thoughts and insight, Hank. And I think it's been observed over the years that
Yes.
a lot of government individuals will maybe like to see external people at the table because they have a perception that somehow this process will be steered or accelerated by their involvement. But I think the experience is actually the opposite. It ends up being too many cooks in the kitchen and not enough community voices coming first and being at the forefront of those conversations. So if we have any lessons learned, that's a good one to relay, Miigwech.
Yeah, that's one of the talks I had with Sia a few years back. I told people have to be involved first, not at the end. And it's coming around slowly.
Absolutely.
Well, thanks for the informative session. I have to leave. Thank you.
Awesome. Have a good day, Henry.
Yep.
Okay, if there isn't anything else. Oh, I see a few
Hey,
people
Cam,
coming
it's Larissa.
Hey, Larissa.
I just want to say, keep up the great work.
Thanks, hon. We're trying hard just to get the word out there and connect people to the processes and the opportunities. Get your voice heard, right?
Exactly. Good job.
Miigwech. All right.
Hi.
Bye, Calvin.
Yeah, I just want to say, yeah, from my perspective also, this is very informative, and it'd be nice if someday we could all sit down in the gym or resource center and give the community a chance to get these types of training from these assessment processes, because it's all over the news, and all of us as grassroots members, we often turn a blind eye to some of this legislation that's being communicated to us, and I often wonder how much of our community grassroots members can actually grasp what's happening in our areas and what the processes that are involved. So hopefully someday, maybe towards when we come to somebody finding a cure for our pandemic here, which is coming, not someday, but maybe in the spring, where we can have community sessions pertaining to this.
Absolutely.
Other than that, this is unfortunately this is the last webinar, right?
No, this is a monthly series that FRWS is running.
Oh,
Yeah, we haven't quite figured out what. Actually, we do. I think
the
know
next
what's
one
coming
is.
next, but yeah, we're trying, Kelvin, to just do this on an ongoing basis, because and but I think the next one is planning on bats.
It's going to be on bat species at risk, so I can share all the awesome work that we've actually been doing with Ganugami and Constance Lake, and we want to expand it further north into the coming years, and we want to get some of that good baseline information that's been missing to help inform things like the regional assessment. So we're excited to share that. But yeah, all of our topics go kind of all over the place, but yeah, check us out on Facebook, and we'll always keep it updated.
Oh, all right, because Henry was just reminding me that we do have two other resource people, Leslie and Eugene, that could have also benefited from these sessions. So I just was wondering if I can probably forward them some information from the previous presentation.
And I can connect with them as well, Calvin. We can do this again in Ganugami. That's no problem. So let me know what works.
Okay, appreciate it. Okay, you guys make great instructors.
Thanks, Calvin.
Thank you. I've got an apple on my desk today, Calvin. I know you said I deserved one. So
I didn't have a Peter Zofsky moment at all. I didn't fall asleep.
Woohoo!
You guys.
Yeah, and just to say, because Laura has recorded it, we think we can probably connect those previously done ones to everyone in the absence of scheduling another one immediately. So hopefully we figure out how to get those circulated soon, and but there's that opportunity is there.
Definitely. I have emailed them out in the past, so anyone who wants to reach out to me to do that, I can definitely arrange that until we have something more permanent, like on our website.
All right. On that note, thank you so much, everybody, and have a great day and a happy Halloween, and we'll see you next month. I know everybody wants to talk about bats. Super exciting. It's Bat Week right now. We'll talk about it in November. Thanks, guys. Have a good day.